Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is an author and game designer. He's also the former creative director at Paizo, along with 30,000 other hats there. His Starfinder Angels of the Drift hardcover collection was just released. Please welcome James Sutter back to Epic Realms. Welcome back, James. How are you doing?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me back. It's nice to be back. I didn't realize it had been 3 years.
Right. It just feels like it just happened the other day.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun watching your stuff come out too in that time as time has progressed and be like,
Yeah,
oh, that's really cool. I should get him on. And it's like, oh, it's really cool. I should get him on. And then it just doesn't happen. And then I would think we were going to do something for a game or something, and that fell through. And I think I was in Seattle, and you weren't busy.
Oh,
So
that's right. That's
things,
right.
Things just weren't lining up all together. But here we are. We've made it, and you're back, and I'm very excited to have you on.
We've got a lot to talk about because my career has gone through some wild shifts in the last few years.
Right? Last time you were on, we talked about Pathfinder, Paizo, Starfinder.
Sure.
You were kind of the main guy working on the Pathfinder Tales. We talked a bit about that. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts because now the Pathfinder novel line is returning. What are your thoughts on that? Are you excited for that? Are you like
I mean,
in
I
that
think it's
at all?
great. I'm not directly involved. It's funny because I have, some of the folks at Paizo have hit me up for, advice or, I think, I believe that Mark Moreland is over there is running the
Yeah.
line now, and he's hits me up, every year or 6 months with just sort of thoughts that he wants to bounce off me,
Yeah.
which I consider a huge honor given that
Yeah.
it's been 7 years or more since I was even at the company.
Right.
But so I appreciate that folks around there are still like, oh, this is kind of James's thing, even though I've been gone for so long. But yeah, no, I think it's cool that they're bringing it back. I love that they're working with some of the authors from the original Pathfinder Tales books that we published. And I just think it's super cool. Like, they're all really talented folks. They did, it's probably not too tales out of school to say that they did approach me about writing something. And my career's in a very different place these days, and I didn't have the time to squeeze it in.
Yeah.
But I was deeply honored that they would be interested in that. And it's super fun to see what they're doing. I haven't had a chance to read Leanne's book yet, but I know it's going to be great. Like, I
Yeah.
loved all the stuff she did, and I guess I should cut off there because I don't know what's been announced and what hasn't. But like, everything they've told me
Cut
about
off
sounds
there. I know a
cool.
few other people
Yeah.
that are in the works. I'm also not supposed to say, but we know
Yeah,
Leanne's out.
exactly.
Leanne's got hers. It's out there. We had Leanne on the show actually.
Oh, great.
The week before it was released, so it was pretty cool to have her on. And I know she doesn't do a lot of stuff like that. So,
Yeah, totally.
if
But
you
I'm
had
glad they're bringing
time,
it back.
would you have said yes to doing something, or was it just like you
I
want to
mean,
stay in your new lane?
there's a bunch of angles to that, right?
Okay.
Because in my heart, I always want to be working on like every project that I've ever touched, like I'm never really done with,
Right.
and so I would love to do another Salim novel for Pathfinder or do more adventures in that world or whatever. But, I'm a full-time writer these days, and a lot of it comes down to time and money.
Yeah.
It's just a question of, do the finances make sense? And unfortunately, or I guess fortunately at the moment, my creator owned work pays better than the stuff that I can do for somebody else
Yeah.
as tie-in. And so it just doesn't make sense for me trying to pay the rent to be writing a lot of tie-in unless it's really lucrative. But at the same time, it's always really hard when I have to say no because these are fun properties. And especially
Right.
with Pathfinder and Starfinder, it's stuff that I deeply love. And so I often will go back even for things where it doesn't make total business sense. Like, I'll do it just because I love it, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, you mentioned the Starfinder Angels of the Drift,
Right.
which was the mini series. I guess it was a 5-issue, 6-issue. I think it was a 5-issue series from Dynamite that stars the Starfinder Iconics, and it was sort of the first comic book outing of those characters. And so when they offered that to me, I jumped immediately. And it's like I hope they're not listening when I say I would have done it for like any amount of money. But I wanted to write those characters. Like those
Yeah.
characters are like family at this point. And the same is true, frankly, of the Pathfinder iconics, and I'm really proud of all the comics I got to write with those.
Yeah.
But these are characters that I was part of the initial development for, and so they feel like mine in a way that, if I get hired to write something for D&D or Star Wars or whoever, not that I've been hired to write anything for Star Wars, but like if I was,
Yet.
like those, yeah, I
Yeah.
know, right? Like other IPs that aren't mine have just a very different pull for me than the ones that I got to be involved in the creation with. So, yeah, I mean, I still will occasionally do some game stuff, will occasionally do some tie-in, but right now I'm just loving my new sort of career path, which is writing queer young adult romance novels.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it later. I know you said you wanted to do it at the end of the interview, but like, I've gone a really different direction and it's been super fun, but also getting to do something different makes it that much more exciting to come back. I like doing a lot of different things because then you've always got like a palate cleanser after each
Yeah.
project.
I always like chatting with you because you seem to know where I'm going to go sometimes. And you mentioned, and of course we can't do the show without at least mentioning a little bit about Salim. You mentioned Salim a little bit earlier. Recently, you did an AMA. What, about 8 months ago, I think, and you
Yeah,
said that you had plans, like you had the whole idea for a third book in your brain and
I
something you
did.
tied to the fate. How much can you tell us about that? Since, or are you like, no,
Oh,
you
I
can't talk
mean,
about it because it's you started it or anything like that?
I mean, I the problem is like none of it everything has developed so much
Right.
since I left that like none of what I was like, ooh, and here's the big reveal, like none of that's canon anymore.
Right.
It's all just my head canon that had I still been, the executive editor of the novel line, like it could have maybe become real canon. Um, but it was going to deal a lot with the eldest and the first world and the secret history of how the gnomes left the first world and how
Okay.
that's tied in. And because I'd also written, like, the first world was really one of my kind of pet areas of Pathfinder. I wrote the setting book, First World Realm of the Fae. Like, I created all the eldest except for Count Runalk, was, I think, Eric Mona had developed part of that initially, but then the rest of it was just blank slate for me. And so the first world, much like sort of the outer space Galarian solar system, those were areas that I had really uh, gotten to just go nuts and do whatever I wanted, and everybody was kind of content to let me be the authority on that. So getting to do a novel set with those characters in that world and bringing in Salim was going to be super fun. I had the outline, and then the novel line just, I mean, it died. And it's unfortunate because it was one of those things, and I don't want to get too much into,
Yeah.
how inside politics, because,
Right.
you know, but at the end of the day, like, this is a business.
Yeah.
Every game company is in the business. And the thing that was so sad about the novel line is that it wasn't that the books weren't selling. It wasn't that nobody was reading them.
Right.
It was just that the opportunity cost was too high because the game products were making so much more money and had so much uh, more potential. But it was the same staff. So at some
Right.
point you say, well, I can have my staff work on a project that makes $10,000 for the company, or I can have the same people spend the same amount of time on a project that makes $100,000.
Right.
Like, that's easy math, even if it, breaks your heart. And I
Right.
think it did break everybody's heart, especially there were some novels that we had already commissioned
Yep.
from, including some like people who are now quite big names,
Right.
um, that it just killed me that we didn't get to put out. But I mean, that's publishing. Like, everybody who works in publishing long enough has a few horror stories.
Yeah.
So it is nice to see that they are bringing the books back and including some of those, original authors, and really like carrying the torch for the old line.
I saw that you were credited with a collaborative book called Before the Gods Reign. How much did you work on that? if
I
anything?
did. This is news to
Yeah,
me.
I see it. You're
Oh, this.
credited on I think Amazon credits you for being a part of
Oh,
that.
I think that's their collection of all the short stories,
Yeah,
like, right?
yeah.
So that okay, so that was we had back when I was running the novel line, we did web fiction on the blog
Hmm.
every I think it was like every Wednesday. And so I would commission all these short stories from different authors, and it did a couple of things. One, it gave people, free fiction set in the world every
Right.
week, which was a nice sort of teaser and sales point for the line,
Yeah.
but also it was my farm league. It was the
Yeah,
place
because
where
how many of those
when I
people became people that got novels?
exactly, like when I found an author who I thought might do a good job, rather than saying, "Hey, I'm gonna give me 100,000 word novel," I could say, "Hey, let's do some serialized fiction. You'll write 4,000, 6,000 words for me." And if it worked out well, like then maybe that would become maybe we would hire them for a novel. And then other people, it was, sometimes it didn't work out, or sometimes it just wasn't the right a novel wasn't the right fit for somebody. Some people are just really good at short stories
Yeah.
or had their own careers but really wanted to dabble, there were a number of times through my career where we got people who were way too famous and popular to actually like want to take a long-term gig working with us, but they still were, they were nerds, right? They wanted to
Yeah.
dip their toe in. And so
Yeah.
that's how like right, I worked with China Mieville, famous fantasy author, to create a nation in the River Kingdoms, for Pathfinder. And that was, he thought that was super fun because, he grew up playing RPGs and was
Yeah.
really into it. And like, there was no way he could afford to give us 6 months and write a novel, but he could absolutely write a couple thousand-word article, and we could work together to create these like anglerfish people
Yeah.
called the Ceratioidae. So yeah, so it was just super fun.
What are your thoughts on the God's Reign events and how they're tackling that?
Honestly, I haven't had a chance to follow it
Okay.
very much. Like, and this is unfortunately a thing that can happen when you work in the game industry long enough
Hmm.
is that uh you both love the thing and it becomes your job. And once it's your job, it's hard for it to be your hobby.
Yeah.
And so by the time I left the company, I was simultaneously at the top of my career. I mean, we'd just launched, Starfinder, which
Right.
was my baby, and I was the creative director. Like, it was literally as good as it gets for me. Um, and that was part of why I decided to leave when I did in 2017, because I was like, I don't think it gets any better than this.
Right.
Like, I think I want to go out on a high note. But also I was pretty burnt out. Like, I was not playing very many games. I was just tired. I
Yeah.
needed a change. And the funny thing is that actually during the pandemic, which was a couple years later, was really when I rediscovered my love of running games again. And I
Right.
started playing, every week over Zoom with my friends who were similarly all locked down.
Yeah.
And so, it was one of those getting everybody online after the kids go to bed kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I ended up running like the longest single continuous campaign of like my life
That's awesome.
during COVID, just because it was like several years of every week.
Yeah.
And it was a joy because it was a way to um reconnect with what I had originally loved about the hobby and like distance myself from it from the job portion of it.
Yeah.
um and just love it, just enjoy it. And I was running published adventures, often ones that I'd written, at least partially, right?
Okay.
So I did a couple of different like adventure paths that like I'd oftentimes, because I love writing the first adventures and adventure paths, so
Yeah.
like I'd get the one that I wrote for the first one because I already knew it, so I didn't have to prep it. But then I'd keep running the adventure path, and then I'd get to, as a fan, be reading through the adventures and running them for my groups, and it's just a really different feeling to be excited about it rather than to be doing it for work,
Which
and
one stands
so
out for you that you ran recently?
oh, well, let's see. God, which ones? So I ran several different campaigns. I ran a Pathfinder campaign that was the seventh arch, which was their sort of like X-Files plus Outer Space one. That was super fun. I ran a Starfinder campaign that was a mix of several of them, but started with fire starters, which I'd
Okay.
written for that one, the Dawn of Flame. I think that's what it was called. And then I also did the cops and robbers one, which I had done. God, what was the name of that? Where I had done essentially a horror like murder house kind of adventure.
Okay.
But I think the one that I probably enjoyed the most was running the Seventh Arch, just because that was the X-Files aspect, plus it was very fey, it dealt with the first world, it dealt with
Yeah.
outer space. It was sort of all my favorite flavors. So that was my favorite of the ones that I had written, but my favorite of the ones that other people had written was Crystal Fraser did the second one in the I think it was the Dawn of Flame Starfinder adventure path. Um and so it went from mine straight into hers, and everything Crystal writes is delightful. Like she's one of the best adventure writers around. So I
Okay.
thought that was a real treat because it's a blend of really creative adventure design and humor. And like for
Okay.
me, humor is a huge part of my gaming experience.
Yeah.
Like I want to make my players laugh. You know, as a GM, I'm constantly like I want to scare them and then I want to crack them up, you know? And so I feel like she really does a great job of that.
Nice. How did you mentioned the comic book, the Starfinder comic book. Did they just say, "Hey, do you want to do this?" and you're like, "Yes," or was there some other stuff going on there? And has this been a plan? And was this your first comic book? You get like
Oh,
three
no, no,
three
no.
different
I had
questions.
written so I had been writing the Pathfinder comic books,
Right, right, right.
various series of those for many
That's
years.
right.
Because I had originally, when we first launched the Pathfinder comics with Dynamite, Jim Zub, who's now on every Marvel book you can imagine, plus Conan,
And we'll be here
etc.
in 2 weeks.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, he's coming on the show.
He's coming on the show. Yeah, 2 weeks from
Oh,
now.
God, that guy is a fountain of wisdom. Like Jim is great. Jim is like I absolutely learned how to write comics from Zub. Um, because what happened is he was writing the comics, and I was one of the people reviewing them as sort of the editor and license person,
Right, right.
just to make sure that everything fit with our world. And so I did that. And then after I think the first two or three miniseries, you know, he did like whatever it was, 18 issues. And then he had to move on to bigger and better things. You know, Marvel was coming knocking.
Yeah.
And so when we needed somebody else to write, they tried out a bunch of us in the office to see, you know, if you wanted to try and write a comic, you know, we did like, I think little like 4 6 page goblin adventures or something. And then from that, I got tapped along with Wes and Eric to start writing the Pathfinder comics,
Okay.
and then I proceeded to do a couple of different series on those. Like I did Origins and Rune Scars, and oh, it's terrible when I can't even remember the name of my own
Well, it's been a
my own
handful of
project.
years. It's been a handful of
It's
years.
been a decade, yeah. But so I'd written a bunch of Pathfinder comics and really loved it. And so I had told, and then the Pathfinder comics kind of stopped for a while, but I'd always told Eric and Mark and everybody else there, like, I love doing the comics. You know, hit me up anytime. And especially, you know, since I was the Starfinder, you
Yeah.
know, creative director, I was like, if ever we can make Starfinder comics happen, I want it. Just let me know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, several years after I left, Mark hit me up and said, "Hey, do you still want this?" And I said, "Absolutely." Uh, yes, and Dynamite was super cool. Like their editor, because we'd worked with him before, like he knew that I would get the content right. He knew
Right.
that he didn't have to be, you know, triple checking everything to make sure that the world's right because I used to be the person doing that job.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they gave me a lot of creative freedom. They knew sort of what they wanted. But then within that, they were just like, go for it. And so I got to really write the hell out of that series and do a lot of fun, weird stuff and put in some really deep cut, nerd Pathfinder jokes,
Yeah.
even just into the background, which I enjoy. I love that's my favorite thing about comics actually is the ability to put a ton of detail into the background that people don't even necessarily see if they're just reading the story. But then when you go back and look through, you see, oh, the sign on that shop,
Right.
or the weird little creatures wandering around in the background. And the artist Ed Jumena did a great job. So it was just a joy.
Dynamite is like this underrated underdog of comics because every time I pick up or look at a Dynamite comic, like their logo looks really like old school and kind of silly,
Yeah,
bang pow sort of thing, except for when you pick it up, it doesn't matter what they put out. Everything they put out looks like $150 million.
they
I
do a
just
great job.
all of their stuff.
And I think it's one of those things where, I used to rail when we first started the Pathfinder novels. I think we all kind of had a chip on our shoulder, but something I talked about a lot was like, there was this sense that IP novels uh weren't quality, that you had sort of like fantasy
Right.
novels, and then you had tie-in novels, which always thought was bogus because like we all grew up reading Star Wars novels. Like
Right.
everybody read the X-Wing books, everybody read Dragonlance, everybody read, all of these things. Um, and so I was really on a mission with Pathfinder Tales to show that like you can have great fantasy by, fantasy authors that can do their own stuff as well.
Yeah.
Um, and you can have it be just as good, but tied into this setting that's already beloved, and like it can be the best of all worlds. And it's funny because at the time, I think that was sort of a flag I was planting in the sand. Nowadays, of course, like with the rise of the MCU and everything, like everything is branded. Like nobody, it's hard to even get
Right.
original stuff out there if you don't have a property attached. So I think things have really flipped. But at the time, we felt like the underdogs.
Yeah, I loved it, and it was at a time where you didn't have a lot of that. The D&D novels really weren't coming out a lot, and you guys were like, "Listen, we're doing this thing that you all want," and it left an impact. Any gaming place I talk to, every gaming place I go to where they're gamers that were gaming at that time, they've all read a Pathfinder Tales novel, every single
Oh,
one of
that's
them. So
awesome.
it's always cool, and that's it's the core of when we brought you on the first time. Half the authors are Pathfinder Tales authors that have been on the show just
Yeah.
because our community loves them so much. So
Well, it was a labor of love for me, like, and we all, it's one of those things where there are projects you do in the RPG business because they make financial sense, and then there's projects you do because it's the reason you got into the business, right? And Pathfinder Tales and comics, for that matter, are both the sorts of things where it's like when we were 12, this is the sort of thing that we would want to do. Like, this is a life goal.
right.
And so we're going to do whatever it takes to make that happen. Um, and so we did, it was fun. And it's nice when those things succeed and, make a lot of money. But sometimes you just got to do it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah. There's a You've worked on a lot of different things. We've talked about the comic books. We've talked about the
Yeah.
novels. Last time you were on, we talked about video games.
Oh, yeah, because
Because you
the,
worked on Starfinder, you worked on the
the
Pathfinder
Amazon
video
game had
game.
just come out. Yeah.
Um, what is kind of the difference when you're putting those together? The difference for you, the shift that you have to make in telling these stories because they're a different style of narrative, right?
You know, I don't know that it really is a thing that I do consciously.
Okay.
I think it's just what does the project need? Because obviously, when you're writing an adventure or a video game, branching narrative, everything is very different because you don't get to decide which choices get made, right? And so you're trying to, in a video game, you're always trying to make branching narrative. Like I think of it like a chain where because you don't have an unlimited budget, you can't just expand outward forever.
Right.
And so you have to give people choices that feel meaningful and branch and take you in different directions. But then slowly but surely, somewhere in the course of those like different branches, things curve back toward another point where they all kind of meet together.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter whether you make the choice to go to the castle or to go to the haunted woods, but whatever you do there, somehow it's going to send you to the dragon's lair, and then
Right.
everything links up again and you can branch out again. And so you create this sort of chain. So, and there's a lot of different tricks that you can use to make sure that people do like to give people the illusion of choice. But even beyond the illusion, like to give people, you want it to be meaningful in the choices that they make, in terms of the rewards they get, in terms of how the decisions they make will inform the story later on. But you also want to make sure that they still keep following the story.
Right.
And that's the essence of video game writing. It's also the essence of game mastering,
Yeah.
right? And so when you're doing a TTRPG, uh, it's similar, but you have even less control. But fortunately, you also have an ally, which is the dungeon master who's reading this
Right.
stuff. And so you can just sort of do your best to set up the dominoes and then trust that you've given them enough to work with, that if the players suddenly go left when they should have gone right, that's the dungeon master's job. That's
Yeah.
what a game master is for.
Right.
So it's a very different way of approaching things. And for instance, like the stuff for game design that I enjoy most is world building. I love doing gazetteers. I love just generating giant lists of weird locations and fun adventure hooks. It's all, for me, it's all about inspiring the game master to tell their own story, not necessarily me telling the story. Um, and so when I switch to narrative, whether that's fiction or comics, it becomes entirely different. I actually don't, weirdly, I don't world build nearly as much for my fiction. And there's a part of me that thinks, I teach these world building classes, and I think, man, if I took my own advice every time, like this would be so good. But I rarely do. Because when I switch to fiction or comics, it's all about character to me.
Right.
Um, and I think that's because I think what drives fiction, what drives story, is character, because we're all fundamentally social apes. We want gossip. We want to know what's going on inside people emotionally.
Right.
And so, really, for me, it was very helpful once I finally realized that character emotion and how characters change over the course of the story is the heart of the story. Like you can have iconic characters like Batman or Sherlock Holmes or whatever that never change anything
Right.
about themselves. It's just an interesting mystery that they then solve. You can do that, but I think you even find in those cases that oftentimes the story arcs that people remember are the ones where they change and learn
Right.
and grow. And so for me, when I'm writing a story, I don't start until I've literally charted out in Excel, like the character arcs of my main character, my love interest, my side characters, and all of their intersecting relationships. How my character relates to their best friend or their parent or their enemy or whatever. Like all of those things have arcs. And I find that to be hugely important in my outlining process, because that way I can break those down into beats. And suddenly I've got this huge collection of character beats and plot beats that I know need to happen. And so then the act of outlining becomes, how many of these beats can I squeeze into the fewest number of scenes so that every scene has so much going on under the surface.
Yeah.
And I think this is important, even, obviously it's important when writing a romance novel, but it's also important when I'm doing, the Starfinder comics. I went through and for every character made sure I knew the emotional arc they were going on, what they were wrestling with through over the course of the story, and where they come out. Uh, and I think that makes even your action scenes so much more interesting. Like, okay, yeah, we're having a laser fight with aliens, but that's so much better if you know that one character is worried about being a bad dad, and another one is worried about being replaced, and another one has a crush on another one, and that one's worried that they aren't very good at their job or whatever. Um, and having all of that going on under the surface lends impact to the battle beyond just sort of a video gamey who got hit, who got hurt.
Yeah.
You it's about emotion.
I love it. I love it. Last time Oh, we talked about this. No, last time we were on, we briefly talked about you stepping away from Pathfinder, stepping away
Yeah.
from that because you wanted to do your own projects. You
Yeah.
mentioned your new projects. You couldn't really talk about them at the time. You didn't like they were still kind of in your brain.
Yeah.
But then now you've got two books coming that have come out since then. You've got
They're already out. Yeah, here
they're
I'll
already
show
out.
them to the
Here
screen.
it is. You got
Bam.
Darkhearts and the Ghost of Us. Of course, Darkhearts was the first one that came out. Of
Yeah.
course, both are
Yeah.
really they're not the same covers at all, but the
No, but
art seems very
they kind of
similar.
rhyme.
Yeah,
Yeah.
same kind of vibes. Are they connected at all, or are they just completely separate?
No, except that they're both like there are some small Easter eggs in that they're set in the same world,
Okay.
which is Seattle. And so they're both set in kind of my hometown area. And there is a little bit of continuity between them, but only a
Okay.
touch. They're different characters, different stories. And so you can read them in either order. But Dark Hearts is the tagline is kind of could you fall in love with the boy who stole your chance to be a rock star? So it's very much uh, basically the main character when he was in middle school formed a band with his best friends, but then everybody's egos got big and he bailed, and then they got huge without him. So now they're traveling the country as massive rock stars, and he's just a normal kid in high school, and he's super grumpy about it. And so the story is him and the lead singer sort of getting thrown back into contact, and realizing that underneath that kind of frenemy status, they're actually kind of into each other. And so they start, this sort of covert romance. But of course, one of them is now a huge celebrity with all that that brings. And then the main character starts thinking, well, if me and the singer are on good terms again, maybe this is my route back into the band. Maybe I can have love and the fame that I was denied. Uh, but of course, anytime you're in a romantic relationship where you're like, how can I use this to advance my own ends? Like, that's
Right.
probably not going to go super well.
Right.
So,
And you wouldn't have a
hijinks
compelling
ensue.
story either, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's Dark Hearts. Um, and so that is gay teen romance. And then uh, The Ghost of Us is female romance, and it is basically 10 Things I Hate About You meets Ghost. So it's about a teenage ghost hunter who finds a ghost, but the ghost won't give her the proof she needs to get famous unless she agrees to take his little sister to prom. So it's a supernatural fake dating story.
Okay.
And yeah, and they're both set in Seattle, so they're really sort of my love letters to the area. And Dark Hearts especially draws a lot from my own life and experiences as an underage, band guy in Seattle.
Yeah.
And also, I wrote it during the pandemic when I was really sort of missing the chance to be out and about in the city. So a lot of the locations that they go to for dates and stuff are like my favorite places that
Okay.
I wasn't able to go. So it was kind of I wrote them almost as a like way to experience my city from a different angle.
Yeah, as a person that was recently in Seattle, I love that town and I can't wait to
Yeah.
come back. So,
Well, and actually, I guess I should throw out the other thing, which is that, like, I say Dark Hearts drew a lot of my own experiences as a musician. It also drew a lot of my own experiences as a queer man. Like the main character's sort of realization of his bisexuality that catches him totally by surprise in the context of, reuniting with his former singer. Uh, in a lot of ways mirrored some of my own realizations in my own life. And so in some ways the book is kind of a letter to teenage me of kind of like here are some things to consider.
yeah. And maybe can help other kids, right?
I hope so. I mean, I think I always said I wish that there was more queer media when I was 15, 16,
Right.
because I feel like I would have figured some things out a lot faster.
Yeah. What was the process? Because you got that first book, right? And you've done stuff with Paizo. Was it a lot easier to get that first book out there, or was it
No.
like you
I-
had to work hard? And
I-
you're like, yeah, I did these other things, but that was through Paizo.
I mean, it's funny because I thought that it would help. I had two novels that people liked, and I had, I was the executive editor of the novel line, like working with Macmillan, with Tor.
Right.
Like I thought I knew a lot of people in the industry, But it turns out the crossover between adult science fiction fantasy and young adult romance, there's not really much crossover there. Like,
Right.
I was surprised by the number of people, like, even after I sold the books, the number of people on my team who had no idea what Pathfinder was or my connection to it was like pretty high.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to start over from the bottom. And now I did have some advantages because I did know, some other successful authors through my work on Pathfinder. Like, I found my agent because my current agent, I've actually been through three agents, but I found my current agent who does young adult stuff because I knew a couple of famous young adult authors who happened to be Pathfinder players.
Okay.
And so we'd, become friends years before. And then when I started writing YA, they went, "Oh, why don't you try our agent?" But the funny thing is that actually, yeah, like in some ways, I had a harder time getting an agent this time around than I did the first time around.
Okay.
Even with all my additional experience and whatnot, just because I was doing something in a different field and I was kind of doing something that was a little bit more complicated, and that I was trying to keep my adult agent while also getting a YA agent,
Right.
and people don't want to share,
Yeah.
but really I was kind of starting from the ground up. And I hope that some folks who followed me from Pathfinder and Starfinder checked out the books, but it is a pretty different audience.
Right.
So,
Was it different to write it? Is the way you set it up, the story, the building, the outlining, any of that kind of
I
stuff?
mean,
The
it was
pacing?
different. It was different only in the freedom that I discovered doing it. Like, because I didn't really plan on writing Darkhearts. I had been working on, science fiction novels.
Okay.
And so I was working on a big sci-fi dystopian thing during when the pandemic started, and I burned out. I could not write any more dark, grim, gritty stuff. And I was reading a ton of young adult romance as like sort of my escape.
Yeah.
And so I I was doing that, and then one day I was reading the Wikipedia entry on Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bassist for the Beatles
Okay.
and left right before they got big. And I was reading that article and thinking, God, what would it have felt like
Right.
to, you leave your band and then they become the Beatles.
Yeah.
And then, because I was also reading all this queer young adult romance at the time, I was like, and then what if you fell in love with the lead singer? And I leapt out of bed and pounded out like the first two chapters. But what I discovered is really like one of the first two chapters was just me ranting in the voice of 17-year-old me about what it's like trying to play all ages clubs in a city, and how that
Yeah.
it starts out super fun and then it becomes a grind because there's just not that much you can do or could do at the time uh, as an underage musician.
Right.
Um, and I sat down I sat back at the end of that and kind of read over it and thought, like, I nobody wants this from me. Like, my agent is not waiting on this. Like, this is not what I should be doing, but it feels so good. And it felt so freeing because, like, I love the Pathfinder Tales novels that I've written, but they had a certain voice, right? They
Right.
have a little bit of that epic fantasy voice,
Right.
a little bit of noir. And this was just much more my actual voice. They're
Okay.
very funny. I can make pop culture references.
Right.
I can make stupid jokes. Um, and it just really let me tap into the humor side of my writing that is not a thing that I really knew existed, but I think is much closer to how I actually talk to people and exist in the world. And so I got to just use my own voice, and it was relaxing and fun. And I kind of went, I think this is good. I think this is actually good. I'm just going to go for it. And I didn't tell my agent until I was done. And then I was kind of like, I know this isn't what you normally like, but here you go. And she gave it back and said, "You're right. This isn't what I like." Like, oh. And so then I spent, with her blessing, I spent 7 months finding another agent. And then fortunately, he was able to turn around and sell it almost immediately. And which was a huge shock to me. But at the time, I was feeling pretty despondent.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, he turned around and sold it. And like, I love the final copy. Like, I love the covers. I think Darkhearts has been translated into like 6 languages at this point. So it's really,
Which is great.
it's fun. And so now as far as I know, I'm a young adult author now, I still enjoy writing adult stuff. I still plan to keep doing adult science fiction and fantasy. I just agreed to a game project I can't talk about, so I like doing all these different things. But young adult has been a blast.
When you announced that book was coming out, you posted it. I don't remember which social media, all of them probably. That book was coming out. I was very excited for you because I knew you from our discussions that you had been working on stuff. And again, I didn't know what you were working on. As far as I knew, you were working on science fiction fantasy at the time. And then that came out. I was like, oh, that is so super cool. You got to do something completely different. And I just had a feeling that it was very refreshing for you because it seemed like you were like re-energized. Just your posts alone, reading them, you seemed re-energized with the industry. So I was very excited and happy for you.
I mean, it was a blast. And I was so inspired by all of these books that I was reading. Like, I think it was specifically there were a bunch, but I remember reading Red, White, and Royal Blue, and that immediately sort of clicking, like just the voice of the characters had me cracking up, like listening to the audiobook and literally laughing out loud. And I just went, God, I want to do that. But that's kind of how I am with everything, with genres of writing, music, whatever. Anytime I see somebody do something that I go, ooh, I like that, my second thought is always, I wonder if I could do that. Which is why I'm a total dilettante. I like working in different genres. I like playing a bunch of different instruments, that kind of thing. And at the same time, I say, oh, I'm doing all this young adult stuff now. I've also sold 4 or 5 horror stories to like top tier horror markets in the last couple years, just because I like being able to do the total opposite there.
Yeah.
So actually, if anybody's interested in my horror work, I think the most recent one was in Nightmare magazine, and I think it's one of the best things I've ever written. It's called To Cheer as They Leave You Behind, and it's all about parenthood and like sort of helicopter parenting, but also time traveling by eating your child's placenta. So it's
okay.
So it's kind of a weird, it's a weird psychological horror. And I'm just really happy with it.
It's so interesting when you look at how stories and novelists and authors have evolved and how the process goes. However, horror is still one of the ones where it's like people still read the stories in magazines. There are tons of magazines out there with horror stories out there. Whereas that, for most other genres, that's kind of a thing of the past. We've got a couple fantasy magazines that come and go and change and shift throughout time. But like, Phantasmagoria is still a thing that's out there that people readily consume all the time and get their stories from there. So it's really cool to talk about that.
And I think there's something about horror. I mean, I think actually that science fiction and fantasy lend themselves really well to short stories anyway, because they're often so, you can be very concept forward, right? Like you can have an idea that's weird and interesting and doesn't need to then become a 300-page, giant character arc. But I think horror especially, sometimes you just want to get straight to the weird, straight to the unsettling. And so most of the horror that I read these days actually is short story. It's collections from, Joe Hill or Nathan Ballingrud or Cass Caw or, whoever it is. I think that form is still alive and vibrant.
And that's also another thing that I love is the anthologies, because you get a lot of short stories in a big book of all these different people. And so it's great. Can you tell us, you did the book Ghost of Us. Can you tell us about why writing from another perspective, if you will? I know we've had a handful of authors that, an author will write about a female or a a white person will write about an indigenous
Sure,
person and
sure.
stuff like that. Can you tell us about the process of that and how you kind of check yourself to make sure what you're saying is accurate to represent those people?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard because the internet, especially in the social media era wants to make everything reductive. Um, and I think a lot of times people will like the sound bite that sometimes people will take away from something is you shouldn't write about anybody who doesn't share your background. Um, but I think that oftentimes the more nuanced take from the same people, if you actually talk to them about it, is like, well, if you're gonna do it, you got to do it well. And that means you need to research, you need to read authors of that background, you need to listen, you need to make sure that you're actually doing the work and not just relying on what you think
Right.
That said, I think in The Ghost of Us it wasn't really that hard because when you look at it, like, yes, she is a different gender, like the main character, Kara, whose perspective I'm writing from in first person, like, yes, she is a different gender. At the same time, she is a bisexual teenage nerdy outcast living in the suburbs of Seattle who's desperate to escape and doesn't really know how and wants to be famous. Like, that's just me.
Right.
That was just teenage me, like, in every way. So like yeah, the our genders are different, but our genders are the only thing that's
Right.
different. And so as a result, I think that the more you can find the elements of a character that you relate to that are similar to you, you can lean into those. Um, and that'll bring the extra authenticity, right? And so I I don't actually think it's that hard if you just write characters uh based on who they are, right? Like, and maybe this is one of the weird things, but like actually for a lot of my novels, I don't decide the genders of the characters until pretty late in the game. Like, I oftentimes I'll have the whole outline and maybe even a couple of chapters, and then I'll be writing and I'll be like, this doesn't really fit. And sometimes I'll switch characters, switch sexualities, things like that. Um, and find the one that feels like it clicks.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, and then of course once I do that, then I also am sure to use beta readers, like I had several, bi and lesbian friends read through the book and tell me, like, does this feel legit? What am I getting right? What am I getting wrong?
Right.
And they gave me great feedback, and uh they were really great about telling me this works, this feels like it was written by a guy, this. But also the other thing is that it's interesting, there are certain things where people feel like their experience is the only experience.
Yeah.
And so I didn't get a lot of pushback on Darkhearts, and I haven't really gotten very much pushback on The Ghost of Us either. Like, generally people like it. But I find with queer material sometimes you'll write a character and then one person will say this is totally unrealistic because X. Um, and then another person will say this absolutely matches my experience for the
Right.
same reason, right? And the answer is that people have wildly different lives. Like,
Yeah.
some people, especially, I often find it comes up around sexuality because people will say, like, oh, well, you know, somebody who didn't start having sex until they were in their 20s might feel like it's really weird that characters are having sex at 18, whereas somebody who started having sex at 15 thinks it's like totally normal. And so
Right.
like you just have to kind of write your own truth. And I mean, if yeah, you're never going to please everybody, so like do the best that you
Yeah.
possibly can, get help from people who know what they're talking about. But at the end of the day, just go for it. And you know what? If you get something wrong and people call you on it, like, say thank you, learn from it, and
Yeah.
do better next time.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I like to ask that question because everybody's got a little bit different perspective, and for the same reason, everybody's got a different perspective, just like you just said, right? And so having a bunch of authors and they all kind of have their opinion on how to do it gives other people hope that like, I can write this other thing and not get bogged down with the what would happen, what if I'm wrong, what if whatever. Do your work,
Well,
get it done, and get input, and
yeah,
you can
and
make
like
mistakes.
to be clear, there are stories that I absolutely that right now at least I would not attempt to write because I feel like I'm not the right person to write them. Like
Right.
it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to bring the level of authenticity necessary to write a given story. But I feel like when you're writing a character that's just one click or one trait off from you, or even just a few, like I think people imagine more division than there is sometimes. Like I think if you're a straight person writing a queer character or a man writing a woman or whatever, just write a believable character. Like
Right.
people are just people. Like the fact that I'm queer or male like informs my experience, but
Right.
it is not the entirety of my experience. Like the, my experience as a, teenage punk rocker or as a game designer or as, a I don't know, a big sort of lefty communal living sort of person. Like these are all things that have as much or more impact on my personality. So if you can lean into those, I think you could write a character that felt authentically like me, without necessarily having to live that experience yourself.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
I don't know. It's a fraught subject, and
It
I'm
is.
sure
It
I'm
is.
gonna dig myself a hole.
Well, we'll get out of the
But
hole. You got any new any upcoming projects you got coming out that you can talk about?
nothing that I can talk about. The only thing I can say really is that like the Angels of the Drift, the Starfinder comic book, the hardcover collection just came out, I think this week. So if people want to pick that up and binge the whole story at once, I'm really proud of it. I think it's super fun. And I hope you'll check it out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Upcoming events, you're going to be at Crypticon Seattle. And guys, I had to specify Crypticon Seattle because there's multiple Crypticons. I was doing
Is
research.
there?
I was like, there's one here in Minneapolis. It's like, you're coming to Minneapolis? How
Oh,
did I not know?
interesting.
And then I was like, oh no, that's the wrong date. So
No,
CrypticonSeattle.com, May 2nd through the 4th.
yeah, that's the local sort of horror convention, and so I know I'll be there at least the Saturday, and possibly some other time. So I'm going to be talking on a couple of panels if anybody wants to swing by and say hi.
And you're going to be at the Emerald City Romance Authors event on June 14th as well.
Yeah, that'll be exciting. That's also in Seattle. That's my first ever pure romance event, so I'll be there at my little table all day. If anybody wants to swing by and grab a book and chat, I would love to see you.
That'll be great. I hope you do really well. I hope you sell all kinds of books at
Thanks.
those events because those should be fun. It'll be neat for you to network too with some of the other romance authors.
Yeah,
in
no,
the
it's
area.
gonna be a very interesting show. I'm sharing a table with Jasmine Silvera, another romance author that I know and like, and so that'll be really fun. But yeah, I'm very curious to see how the energy is different from science fiction, fantasy, or gaming conventions. I have heard that I have heard that we think, in science fiction, fantasy, and games, we think that our fans are passionate, and I've heard from friends in romance like, oh no no, nerds have nothing on romance readers. Like romance fans are hardcore. So I look forward to experiencing that.
That's going to be great. Awesome. And people can find you at jameslsutter.com.
Yep.
You're on Blue Sky at
Yeah, exactly.
jameslsutter.bluesky.social.xyz, whatever. And Instagram at James_L_Sutter.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Anywhere else you wanted to find you?
No, those are great. Like I'm always happy to chat with folks. So, feel free to drop me a line. And yeah, please do check out Darkhearts and the Ghost of Us. You can find them all anywhere books are sold. You can do, I know we're all, it seems like everybody's trying to move away from Amazon these days. But I'll throw out that like the Libro.fm versions, like the audiobooks especially. I love all the editions, but I especially love the audiobooks because they let me record the intro and outro music for both of them.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, it was a fun little Easter egg that like I've got this book drawing on my band ears, and like when you play it, that's just me. So
That's great. I'm gonna have to pick that up. I do like myself some audiobooks, as everybody knows. So
yeah. I mean, they're great.
everybody in the chat room, please stick around. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in any of the chats. We've got all the chats up here. We'll answer all of those questions for you here in just a bit. But coming up next for Epic Realms, as we mentioned earlier in the show, Jim Zub is a renowned comic book writer and gaming geek as well. He's going to be joining us live April 7th, and the podcast will be available on the 8th. Of course, also down the road, we're going to be having writer Trevor Batis is going to be joining us. Kelly Fitzpatrick and RPG legend Bruce Nemeth is going to be joining us. Bruce Nesmith, I can say that, is going to be joining us as well. So please follow, subscribe, rate, review, push all of the buttons, and make sure to help us out there because it also helps our guests. What were you going to say?
I'm going to throw in one plug. Seriously, listen to the Jim Zub episode, because when I got my chance to write comics, the first thing I did was went immediately to Jim's website and read all of his tutorials that he has linked on his homepage. And there is no better masterclass for how to write comics. Like, he taught me how to be a comic book writer in like a weekend just by reading all his essays. So check them out. They're free.
Awesome. Thank you guys all for hanging out, and thank you for listening to Epic Realms.